I'm Jeremy Scahill from Dropsite News, dropsitenews.com. And as I'm speaking to you right now, we are witnessing in Gaza a sustained campaign of mass murder. Yes, this is a genocide. It's a genocidal war that is being facilitated by the United States primarily, as well as other Western countries. But what we're witnessing right now, I think can accurately be described as murder, the widespread murder in particular of children. The scenes that we are seeing coming out of Gaza are utterly horrifying. Drone strikes that are hitting children as they ride bicycles or as they gather together, tents that are being set on fire, so-called suicide drones that are being launched at camps that are housing forcibly displaced people. This is a mass murder campaign within a genocidal war, and the news coverage is just going away. The eyes of the large media are shifting away from Gaza as the killing intensifies. If you look at images right now of Rafah or other places throughout Gaza, there's almost nothing that you could see that would be considered even a target to be bombing. And what we're witnessing is murder. We're witnessing in front of our eyes the murder of Palestinians, and the world is doing absolutely nothing about it. And as this murder unfolds, we have a reality where the Hamas movement, its leadership, has said that it is willing to engage in what it calls a hudna, a long-term truce with Israel. And under the terms that Hamas has laid out recently to the mediators in Cairo, the Egyptian and Qatari mediators are the primary regional forces that are trying to broker some sort of a deal. They have said that they will immediately release all of the Israeli captives, living and dead. And what they want in return is a 5 to 7 year long-term truce with Israel. Now, Israel yesterday said that's not going to happen. They're not going to engage in any sort of a long-term truce. So what is being presented from the other side? Well, Egypt in particular has now started to push, we understand, what is very clearly an Israeli idea for how to move to the next phase of the so-called negotiations. And what it amounts to is the Israelis seeking to try to get as many captives, Israeli captives, released from Gaza as possible while giving up as little in return for those captives as possible. And what Israel has done is to place a set of demands on Hamas that it knows Hamas cannot and will not accept. And it has to do with the total disarmament, not just of Hamas, but of the entire Gaza Strip. From the perspective of Hamas, it's not about their individual weapons. It's about the fact that the Palestinian people have been engaged in a 76-year war of self-defense to try to preserve their humanity, to try to protect their territory, to try to protect the very existence of the Palestinian people. So, while I hear people saying, well, if Hamas just surrenders, if they give up their weapons, all of this is going to end. No, 76 years of history has indicated that that's a grand lie, that that's a lethal lie. And so we're in a situation now where the United States, the most powerful nation in the world, is continuing to supply Israel with an unending stream of weapons, the most sophisticated weaponry in the world that is being used to light children on fire, to bomb tents, to engage in a mass murder campaign, as Benjamin Netanyahu thrives in the zenith of his political career, which has always been about the annihilation of the Palestinian people. We're going to talk about all of these issues. We're going to talk about what's happening on the ground inside of Gaza right now. We're going to talk about the so-called negotiation process that is underway. And we're also going to talk about some of the key figures who have emerged as leaders of the Palestinian armed resistance during this period. I'm very honored to be joined by an excellent journalist who is originally from Gaza. Mohammad Alsaafin is an executive producer at AJ Plus. That's Al Jazeera's online short form storytelling platform. He's also an independent journalist. He's written for The Nation and other publications, one of the sharpest analysts that is around right now. Mohammed, thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Jeremy. It's an honor.
So let's begin first of all with the ground reality in Gaza. We've seen 18 months of just mass killing operations. It certainly is a genocidal war. But over the past few weeks, we have seen, even though they've killed more than 200 journalists and the amount of footage that we're getting out of Gaza has gone down, the images that we're seeing are overwhelmingly of women and children being killed largely with American weaponry. Talk about this immediate moment that we're seeing.
Sure. I mean, what we're seeing now is essentially a continuation of what's been happening since October 8th or October 7th, 2023. It's a wide-scale mass slaughter event. The targets are ostensibly militants, but you don't see that very often. The militants are not hanging about in public, in open spaces. What we're seeing, I mean, just over the last couple of days, we've seen people killed at a cafe. We've seen children killed riding their bikes. We've seen children killed at food collection points or at soup kitchens. We've seen families wiped out as they cower in their homes. We've seen tents blown up. I mean, I never thought I'd live to see the day when sophisticated drones and fighter jets will be using American-made missiles to bomb fabric, to bomb tents and incinerate the people inside. That's what we're seeing now. And the Israeli press doesn't hide that. Israeli politicians don't hide that what they're doing is they are attacking civilian infrastructure, women and children, in order to put more pressure on Hamas to not come to the negotiating table, because they have been negotiating, but to accept Israel's terms, which keep changing. I mean, we had a ceasefire that was put in place in January. It was based on terms that had essentially been agreed to 8 months prior, according to the negotiators, but it took pressure by the incoming president at the time, Donald Trump, on the Israelis, which recent reporting, and we can talk about this perhaps, Jeremy, recent reporting indicates was the first time the Israelis faced any kind of American pressure to adhere to a ceasefire. And they did, and it lasted 7 weeks, 8 weeks. The majority of the Israelis who have been held captive in Gaza, ostensibly the reason behind the Israeli assault on Gaza, were freed in prisoner swaps. And then Israel decided to change the terms of the deal to inflict a full-on siege, no food. I mean, it's kind of couched in technical terms, a blockade on aid. What that means is no food has gotten inside to 2 million people trapped with no way out, no food, no water, no medicine, all while being attacked from the land, the sea, and the air. And so it is absolutely horrifying what we're seeing. It is gruesome. The images we're seeing are, I mean, once you see them, it's hard to kind of to shake what you see. It's hard to accept that we live in a world where this kind of mass slaughter targeting children, especially, can occur live streamed in 4K, and the world just keeps turning.
You mentioned there the blockade, and I want to underscore this because while we're witnessing this heavy bombardment, the use of suicide drones, the clear targeting of civilians in a mass slaughter, mass murder campaign, it's been almost 2 months now that not a morsel of food has entered the Gaza Strip. Not a single vaccination dose has entered the Gaza Strip. No fuel has entered the Gaza Strip. No tents. Certainly no mobile homes. Even under the terms of the original agreement, Israel was refusing to provide all but a small number of tents. There were supposed to be 200,000 tents, 60,000 mobile homes. Israel recently also blew up bulldozers and other construction equipment that was being used to recover bodies from rubble and to try to clear spaces that people could live in. So you don't just have the military aspect of this, the military assaults. You have the use of food, medicine, and other life-supporting supplies as a weapon of war. And Netanyahu, as he has done throughout his career, messages some things in English and messages other things in Hebrew. And he's been, and you can talk about this, he's been really telegraphing this idea that the intent of this is not actually to get all of the Israeli captives out, because then the so-called game would be up. But he's also been very clear, along with other Israeli officials, that they are tying the livelihood or the life of even Palestinian children in Gaza's ability to eat to Hamas completely capitulating, to the entire Gaza Strip surrendering and agreeing to terms that would essentially bring the end of the Palestinian quest for liberation and self-determination.
Correct. I mean, the senior Israeli official. Well, actually, let's take a little step back, Jeremy. In the very first days of this assault, back in 2023, the Israeli defense minister announced that there would be a complete blockade. There would be no entry of food, water. There would be no electricity entering Gaza. So that is, on the face of it, an attack on civilians, on civilian infrastructure, and on civilians. The Israeli prime minister said that Gaza would be turned into a city of tents. That has happened. So there is clearly an intention, clearly telegraphed from day one, to destroy Gaza as a livable place. And by definition, that means attacking civilians, attacking their livelihood, attacking their ability to continue living in Gaza. What we see now is a continuation of that. Yoav Gallant, the former Israeli defense minister who made those announcements in the first days of the war, was indicted by the International Criminal Court for those statements, for saying that the intention would be to cut off food, water, medicine, etc. His successor, Israel Katz, says that openly now. He comes out and he says it, and he posts pre-recorded videos addressing the people of Gaza, saying that there will be no food entering until Hamas capitulates. These are war crimes, and it's interesting to me that what the Israelis are doing is kind of exposing the toothlessness of the International Criminal Court system, of the kind of global liberal order, the post-World War II order, and they're doing it with the full complicity and support of countries like the United States, which continue to arm Israel, even as its leaders openly declare their intention to commit war crimes.
Mohammed, I want to ask you. Let's talk a bit about the so-called negotiations. I call them so-called because what's happening right now is you have a delegation from Hamas will go to Egypt. Sometimes they go to Doha, to Qatar. You have Israeli officials. Ron Dermer right now is the lead Israeli official that is technically in charge of the negotiations on the Israeli side, which is a shift because throughout much of the genocide, it was the head of Shin Bet and other intelligence officials that were leading the negotiations. Now it's a guy who is essentially kind of a political hitman operating at the direction of Benjamin Netanyahu himself. But Ron Dermer is meeting with the head of Egyptian intelligence. So you have these kind of parallel efforts going on. And on the one hand, you have the Israelis saying our red line is Hamas needs to formally surrender and that the Gaza Strip needs to be entirely demilitarized as a condition to do anything. And so what Israel has put on the table, and it's being communicated primarily through the Egyptian mediators to Hamas, and I have sources that are saying that the Egyptians are actually putting a lot of pressure on Hamas to accept this kind of a deal. Qatar is another question. The Israelis are really engaged in a propaganda campaign right now against Qatar. The Qatari prime minister gave quite a sharp rebuke to Israel in a press conference with Turkish leader the other day. So there's some question about what exactly is Qatar's stance in this. But what I'm hearing from sources that Egypt is pushing Hamas to accept the deal that falls far short of what Hamas has said is sort of its bottom line of what it would agree to. But to make this simple, what's on the table right now is basically something in the range of a 45-day short-term truce where Hamas would have to give up a lot in terms of what it has described as its red lines. There would be an exchange of Israeli captives for Palestinians that are being held. But in the draft document that we obtained that's being put before Hamas, it seems to supersede that January agreement in its terms. And the January agreement, to remind people, was 3 42-day phases. The first phase, which ended on March 1st, was going to involve an exchange of captives, the resumption of humanitarian aid. That happened. It didn't happen at the levels that was agreed upon, but it did happen. And then within that first couple of weeks of phase one, Israel was supposed to start negotiating with Hamas over the technical implementation of phase two. And phase two was stipulated that all Israeli forces were going to be withdrawn from Gaza. and that there were going to be discussions toward a permanent truce that would take hold. And then phase 3 was going to be a reconstructive phase and a so-called day after phase. And there are questions about what type of body would govern Gaza in the interim ahead of democratic elections. Hamas has said, and yet it keeps getting reported as though they haven't, Hamas has said, we will step down as the governing authority of Gaza. That's been their position for many, many weeks, but it keeps getting reported as Hamas refuses to relinquish power. Hamas has said that it will relinquish power, and it's said that it will support an independent committee of Palestinians to come in and govern the Gaza Strip. What Israel did was to blow up that ceasefire by not participating in the negotiations, the technical negotiations for phase 2. The next day, then, they imposed the full spectrum blockade on Gaza. And then on March 18th, Israel initiates a scorched earth terror bombing campaign that kills hundreds of people in its opening 24 hours, the majority of them women and children, and has continued to engage in heavy bombardment of Gaza ever since. So what now is on the table is something in the range of 45 days, an exchange of certain captives, and no guarantee that there will be any return to a framework that could lead to a permanent end to the war. Hamas has said, we won't engage anymore in these temporary deals unless there's a clear path back to phase 2 of the deal that we signed, that Israel signed, that the United States, Qatar, and Egypt were the guarantors of. So that's what's being presented right now to Hamas. Hamas countered and said, actually, we want to aim higher. We want something in the range of a 5 to 7 year deal, and we're willing to immediately release all of the Israeli captives. And what's interesting, you mentioned earlier about Donald Trump versus Joe Biden. I've also heard from sources within the Palestinian resistance. They understand very well who Donald Trump is. They know that Steve Witkoff is a dedicated Zionist. They don't believe that they're dealing with independent brokers. But what they're saying is, for the first time in this process, we saw people actually force Netanyahu to come to the table and make a deal that wasn't part of his entirely maximalist agenda. So in a way right now, Mohammed, the only hope of something happening really relies on Donald Trump. He has his visit coming up to Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the Emirates soon. There's a lot of indications that he doesn't want there to be this open military scorched earth bombing going on when he goes there. But that's what Hamas is facing right now, is basically Israel has said, we're not doing a hudna with you. And you need to engage in a short-term deal that includes your disarmament and does not offer any clear path to negotiating a permanent ceasefire.
Well, one thing has remained true from day one of this assault, and actually has always remained true throughout the previous assaults on Gaza, which is that they end when the United States tells Israel to end. That is the bottom line. The one power in the world that has the ability to force Netanyahu overnight to stop his bombing anywhere in the world is the United States and the United States president. That was true under Joe Biden. It happened in 2021. It was true under Barack Obama in 2014 and 2008, 2009. And it's true now. Like I said, the first time anyone applied any real pressure on Netanyahu to commit to a ceasefire was when when Steve Witkoff traveled to Tel Aviv and told told Netanyahu, you're signing the ceasefire deal now. Donald Trump does not want the war to be ongoing while he's being inaugurated. Now, so that truly remains the case. Whatever the Egyptians or the Qataris or anyone else says, the Israelis rely on the United States for everything in this war, primarily for weaponry and also diplomatic cover. So when the United States says stop, the Israelis will stop. I want to go back to a couple of things you mentioned earlier when you talked about the role that the Egyptians are playing in putting a lot of pressure on Hamas to accept these new Israeli terms. This is actually pretty much par for the course for Egypt in its role as a mediator between Israel and Hamas. In all previous rounds, Egypt has taken a very pro-Israel line, very tough on Hamas. And that's actually that kind of outlook has been what's enabled Qatar, this small Gulf country, to emerge as a power broker when it comes to international negotiations, and especially between Israelis and Palestinians, because they're seen as a more fair and a more even-handed negotiator or a mediator, sorry, between the Israelis and the Palestinians. So what the Egyptians are doing right now is not a surprise. It's also not a surprise that these new Israeli terms, which are on the face of them unacceptable to Palestinians, are being presented through through Egypt. The second thing I want to say is you mentioned Hamas saying that they'd be willing to step down from power in Gaza as part of a final truce. Hamas has been offering this since 2014. Hamas does not and has not wanted to take on the burden of governing Gaza for more than 10 years now. Gaza has been in a state of closure since the early 90s by Israel. Its economy has been deliberately developed. It has been under a crippling siege since 2007, where the Israelis at one point admitted they were counting the amount of calories that they were allowing into Gaza. So Hamas does not want that burden. What they refuse to do, though, is disarm, because disarmament opens up the Palestinians to slaughter. I mean, the Israelis themselves are giving Hamas no incentive to give up their arms, because what they're saying plainly is that the goal is not to reach a ceasefire or a truce. The goal is to empty Gaza of Palestinians. And if you, as the prime resistance movement in Gaza, give up your arms, all you're doing is making the displacement of your people much easier for the Israelis to carry out. The Israelis have been very open that ethnic cleansing is their goal. So what we're seeing is an attempt by Israel to try and force through, like we said earlier, the pressure campaign that's being waged on civilians by cutting off food, by killing women and children en masse, to force Hamas to come to an agreement or come to to agree to things that have always been a red line for the Palestinian resistance. My analysis is that will not happen. It would be suicide for Hamas as a movement, but also suicide for the Palestinian cause. And I think Palestinians are very aware of that. There have been historical precedents during the 1947-1948 war, when Palestinians were pretty much disarmed by what was at the time the British occupation. It made it far easier for Zionist militias to then take over and displace 750,000 Palestinians so that they could create the state of Israel on the ruins of their towns and villages. In 1982, the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, agreed to leave Lebanon under a U.S. guarantee that the Palestinian refugees in Lebanon would be kept safe. And 2 weeks later, the Sabra and Shatila massacre took place under Israeli auspices. So there's no historical incentive, and there's no current incentive for Hamas or any other resistance movement to give up their weapons in the face of Israel's very clearly stated goals of ethnic cleansing.
Yeah, I mean, there's also the practical issue here that I've heard also from some people within Hamas and Islamic Jihad, which is that, Hamas doesn't really have the right to sign that term over. If they, there are commanders on the ground of various factions. I mean, everyone uses the term Hamas, but there are multiple Palestinian factions with different political outlooks that have been participating in armed struggle against Israel for decades, and since October 7th, and on October 7th itself. But there's also this issue that Israel and the United States both have promoted this notion that to defend the right of Palestinians, which all people in the world have, to use arms to try to fight against occupation, to try to defeat an apartheid occupying force, that necessarily must be categorized as terrorism. This is, this was also how Nelson Mandela and the armed wing of the African National Congress were characterized. But in the Palestine example, it's far more intense of a misportrayal of a whole group of people in an effort to undermine legitimate rights that are protected under international law and historical precedent. So, there's the practical aspect of this, which is, even if some officials that say we represent Hamas sign a piece of paper with Israel, that doesn't mean that every Palestinian is going to say, oh, we're also going to lay down our arms, because, as you say, history shows this would be suicide on the part of the Palestinians. And the narrative and the use of the term terrorism is quite incendiary in these cases. I mean, the very definition of terrorism is what we're witnessing on a daily basis being inflicted on the people of Gaza, where you are targeting civilians in an effort to try to change or alter a policy. That's the officially stated agenda of Israel right now. And it's not just the
say
bombs,
it,
it's also the food.
they say it openly. Yeah.
Right. So on this issue of disarmament, for people that say, well, if Hamas just agrees to lay down its arms, they're the ones pretending that Hamas speaks for all Palestinians, which is certainly not the case. And there's no guarantee that any Palestinian is going to listen to what any of the political figures of Hamas say if they make such an agreement. I mean, maybe Hamas can control some aspects of this, but there may even be commanders within the Qassam brigades that say, absolutely not. This would be to disrespect the blood of all of our martyrs if we now lay down our weapons.
I mean, it's not even, I mean, you don't even have to kind of go that far. It is, these people understand that if they give up their weapons, they become sitting ducks. It's as simple as that. There's no guarantee. Look, in previous historical examples that I gave, there was an attempt by other powers to convince the Palestinians that there would be a guarantee of their safety if they did disarm or give up their arms. There isn't even that pretense anymore. The Israelis and the Americans are saying the goal is that we're going to kick you out of your home, we're going to ethnically cleanse you, right? So this notion that if Hamas disarms, the Palestinians will be better off is bellied by the fact that day in, day out, the Israelis are saying, no, actually what we want to do is kill all these people and force the rest to leave. So this is why when I say these terms are unacceptable, it's not just unacceptable in a kind of on a principled level, it's unacceptable on a practical level. You're asking people to willingly give themselves up to the slaughter.
I want to ask you about the recent comments that the Palestinian Authority leader Mahmoud Abbas made when he spoke to the Palestinian National Council. He did this performance where he called Hamas sons of dogs, and there's a translation of it that could even be a harsher term, but let's go with sons of dogs for now, and said, release the hostages and lay down your arms. And he's now put in place for the first time, a vice president that appears to be, who he wants to be his successor. I mean, Abbas is 89 years old. His popularity ratings are in single digits. He's widely viewed as being a collaborator with the Israeli occupation forces in the West Bank, and also in the positions that he's taken on the Gaza war. But this could become quite relevant if there is some deal made. If Trump allows Arab nations to play a role in what they're calling the day after, it does seem like the most likely scenario would either be foreigners coming in. That's one thing on the table from regional countries, or it would be that the governance of Gaza gets placed under the auspices of the Palestinian Authority. To talk for a moment about those dynamics, the rhetoric that Abbas was using, his standing, and what this might mean if we do get to a point where there's a real discussion about the so-called day after.
Sure. I mean, like I said, Hamas have been striving to give up the governance of Gaza to the Palestinian Authority for more than 10 years. The holdup there has been that Hamas refuses to disarm. So we're talking about disarmament being a condition of, or a new Israeli condition. It's actually been a condition for more than a decade, right? When the Palestinian Authority and Hamas came to an agreement in 2014 for Hamas to hand over the governance of Gaza to the Palestinian Authority, Hamas gave up all their ministerial roles or the prime ministership. Ismail Haniyeh was the prime minister of Gaza at the time, to the Palestinian Authority. The idea was that it would create a unity government under a man called Rami al-Hamdallah. He was officially the prime minister of both the West Bank and Gaza, and the holdup there was an Israeli and U.S. insistence that they would not deal with this new unity government as long as Hamas was part of it, because Hamas had not disarmed. So these conditions about Hamas disarming, about laying down their weapons, have been in place for more than a decade. And prior to kind of October 7th and the ongoing subsequent genocide, Hamas was not going to give up their arms. It makes it even more unlikely that they will now. As for Abbas, like you said, he's a very unpopular figure. His newly assigned deputy is actually not someone that he necessarily wants to put in place, but actually is the person that the Israelis want. His name is Hussein Sheikh. He's been kind of the leader of the security coordination with the Israelis for the past few years. He has played a role in combating any kind of armed resistance in the West Bank. He played a role back in 2021. He, was given the Israelis let him drive his own car into an Israeli prison inside the 1948 borders in what people term Israel proper, to pressure Marwan Barghouti, the most popular Fatah leader who's in Israeli jail, to not stand in elections against Mahmoud Abbas. That's how much the Israelis trust this guy. And now he is being groomed to be the successor to Mahmoud Abbas as the head of the Palestinian Authority. Abbas's outburst, is nothing new. His language indicates a man who, is frustrated. His entire life's work has been based on the notion that if you lay down your weapons, disarm in the West Bank, negotiate with the Israelis, then that is the path towards Palestinian statehood. What he's received instead from the Israelis is a complete kind of abrogation of Palestinian sovereignty, expanded settlement activity in the West Bank, ongoing pogroms against isolated Palestinian communities, the mass displacement of tens of thousands of people from both the northern and southern West Bank, all while Abbas has nothing to show his people for his life's work. His call on Hamas to give up the Israeli hostages again makes no practical sense. The captives that Hamas holds in Gaza are the group's biggest kind of like power card right now. It's the main leverage that they have in negotiations. You talked, Jeremy, earlier about how any notion of Palestinian resistance against Israeli domination is always portrayed as necessarily as terrorism. I think a really kind of key example of that is the captives that Hamas took on October 7th. There's just no willingness, especially in kind of the West, to discuss what the motivations might have been. Now, you can say that taking civilians captive is a war crime. It is not to be condoned. But the reason that Palestinian groups took Israeli civilians and soldiers captive on October 7th was to exchange them for the tens of thousands of Palestinians that have been rotting away in Israeli jails for years, including children, and with no kind of outcry from the international community or no one pressuring Israel to release these people. So we can talk maybe a little bit about how the label of terrorism is placed on Palestinian resistance to kind of undercut any attempt to understand what the political motivations are.
Right. And before you do that, you mentioned something that I think is important, because there's a lot of attention paid to the conditions under which Israelis are being held in Gaza. And as we hear these stories, and there's, they come out every few days, there's a new story about an Israeli who had been held captive, and they're describing their time in captivity. And in the midst of this, we don't just have testimony from Palestinians about their treatment in prisons. We also, in Israeli prisons, we also have Israeli human rights groups themselves that are describing torture chambers that exist to hold Palestinians. And on the issue also of dead captives that are being held in the Gaza Strip, Israel, for a very long time, has held the bodies of Palestinians either in numbered graves or in freezers. And when Palestinians who are killed by Israel, when their bodies are returned to Gaza, if they're lucky, they've been placed in a garbage bag and are thrown off of a truck.
Yeah, with no identification. Yep.
With no identification whatsoever, or it's part of someone's body that's in a bag and it's just thrown onto a truck. the narrative is so upside down in so many aspects of this war. And it brings me to this, what you're starting to raise now, which, I know this is considered a taboo subject, but I actually think we need to talk about it. We are not allowed to speak about who the leaders of Palestinian resistance factions are, or you're labeled a supporter of those factions, or you're called a terror supporter. But if we fail to study history, if we fail to understand how major world events unfold, then we're not really interested in knowing the truth about anything. And you've done a couple of really insightful pieces about some of the figures who were key players in the decision to launch what was called Operation Al-Aqsa Flood on October 7th, 2023. And I want to begin by asking you to describe who Yahya Sinwar actually was. You start with where he was born, what his upbringing was like. Sinwar, for people that may not be familiar, at the time that he was killed in battle by the Israelis, not hiding in a tunnel, autopsy showed that he hadn't eaten almost anything for 3 days. He was not living off of stolen aid, as was said about him. Totally cartoonish portrayal of him. Regardless of what anyone thinks about the facts of it, we should understand who Yahya Sinwar was, because in many ways, his story is the story of armed resistance in Gaza. So as someone who has really studied his life, Mohammed, maybe start from the beginning and walk us through who Sinwar was.
So Yahya Sinwar was born in the 1960s in the Khan Yunis refugee camp. Quite a few of the leaders of Hamas, and especially the Qassam brigades, were born in the Khan Yunis refugee camp in the 1960s. Mohammad Deif was also, I think he and Sinwar were neighbors or lived near each other, grew up near each other. Sinwar was a dynamic and strong-willed personality, often kind of cartoonishly referred to as a hardliner, but Sinwar was one of the first members of the initial Hamas military wing in the late 1980s. So the group was formed in late December 1987. They had what they called an internal security force, where they were tasked with kind of weeding out collaborators in Gaza at the time. Now, at the time, collaborators were actually pretty easy to find, and they were well known because they were Palestinians who were given arms by the Israelis. And because there was no military presence for any kind of Palestinian resistance, they could move and walk around freely. Sinwar was tasked with rooting out some of these collaborators, and when the Israelis caught him, I think in 89 or 88, he was accused of killing several Palestinian collaborators and sentenced to several life sentences in Israeli jails. He spent more than 20 years in jail and was released in the prisoner swap in 2011. But during his time in jail, he was kind of out of sight, out of mind. He wasn't really a well-known figure to the Palestinian public, but he was a big leader in the prisoner movement inside Israeli jail. So for Hamas, their leadership is kind of divided between what they call the internal leadership, that's in Gaza and the West Bank, the external leadership, that's leadership that lives abroad, and then the prisoner leadership. And they all have a say in the group's strategic thinking and strategic planning. Sinwar was very senior in the prisoner movement, and he helped negotiate the deal that saw him freed. So when Hamas captured an Israeli soldier out of a tank on the Israeli border with Gaza in 2006, the negotiations were done under German mediation. They took about 5 years, very, very difficult negotiations. And at one point, as the negotiators, believed that they'd come to an agreement and a deal, they decided on who would be released in exchange for this captured Israeli soldier. The list was sent to Yahya Sinwar in Israeli prison. And Sinwar took a look at it. His name was top of the list. And he noticed that all the Palestinian prisoners to be released were from Gaza and the West Bank. And for him, that was a problem because he noticed that there were no Palestinians from Jerusalem that were on the list. And this was a very important symbol for him because the Israelis have annexed Jerusalem, considered part of their capital. and the Palestinians in Jerusalem are not allowed to participate in any kind of political life, Palestinian political life. And so for Sinwar, he felt that not having any prisoners released from Jerusalem would be an abandonment of a symbolic abandonment of the city that the Palestinians want to claim as their capital. So he refused to sign off on the list, knowing that the Israeli authorities would punish him. And he was immediately sent into solitary for several months. But at the end, the deal was signed, and Sinwar got his way. The list of prisoners freed, I think it was 1,024 prisoners. Sinwar was on top of that list, but it also included many people from Jerusalem as well. So that's the kind of man that he was, very strong-willed, even while kind of in Israeli prison, even while he was subject to the whims of Israeli prison wardens. He was the kind of man that just would not give in on things that he saw as key principles, even when the balance of power was very much against him.
And while he was in prison, he wrote a couple of books, both fiction and nonfiction. But he also became a student of the Hebrew language and of Israeli history and of Jewish history. And one of the projects that he undertook, and he also took a number of online courses while he was, or correspondence courses while he was in prison. But among the projects that he undertook was to, by hand, translate from Hebrew into Arabic memoirs of the former heads of Shin Bet. And what's clear is that he treated prison also as a classroom of sorts to study the enemy. And by the time he was freed under this deal that he played a major role in negotiating, where the Hamas returned Gilad Shalit, the Israeli soldier, he had completed what was essentially a PhD in the study of Israel's security state, its culture, its mentality toward the Palestinian. And there's all kinds of stories from guys that were in prison with him about hand delivering some of these manuscripts around, so that and Sinwar encouraging people to read the memoirs of the Shin Bet, the former heads of the Shin Bet. In fact, some of his Israelis, you have to be careful with Israeli sourcing on this, because there's also a lot of fantastical, almost certainly false stories that have been promoted about things Sinwar has said, or that his nickname was the Butcher of Khan Yunis, which seems to be entirely an Israeli and Western media invention. But you do have stories that I think ring quite true in terms of Sinwar telling people who were his interrogators or others being in touch with him that one day he was going to come back in a spectacular way, and they were going to be on the other side of it. But he then is released from prison. He returns to Gaza, and eventually he ascends to the political leadership of Hamas. So take it sort of from that period as he comes back out of prison, returns to Gaza, and then becomes a very, very public figure.
So I think one thing I caution people is to not assume that Yahya Sinwar came out of prison with this idea of carrying out Operation Al-Aqsa Flood kind of formed in his mind, ready to go. His life as a public figure in Gaza and then as a leader of Hamas in Gaza indicates something actually slightly different. When he went to prison, Hamas was just a small group of, you could count the number of members of Hamas on a couple of hands, right? Just a few dozen people. He came out and he saw basically the Qassam brigades had become a mini army. He saw that the movement had become a government, and that he saw that it had a presence all over the Palestinian territories, as well as in several Arab countries as well. So it was a very different world that he came out of jail into. But also, as he became the leader of Hamas in Gaza, he had to confront the fact that the people in Gaza were had been suffering for decades under this crippling closure and then siege. And I think it's very instructive to read the two interviews that he gave to foreign journalists. In 2018, he spoke to an Italian journalist for the Italian newspaper La Repubblica. And the interview was then translated into Hebrew and English by multiple Israeli newspapers. And in it, and this was in the context of the Great March of Return, which, if you remember, Jeremy, 2018, for an entire year, every week, tens of thousands of Palestinians would march unarmed peacefully to the boundary with Israel, calling for an end to the siege and a return to their homes. So a completely civil, peaceful march. And Hamas leaders, including Yahya Sinwar, took part in that every single week and encouraged it and stood by kind of the decision to protest in this unarmed fashion, even though, like I said, they had a mini army in Gaza. And during that interview, Sinwar spoke of the need to lift the siege on Gaza, and he spoke, and these are his words. He spoke about his heartbreak at seeing young people in Gaza, especially when they go to the sea, which is kind of Gaza's only kind of frontier that isn't with Israel, and just staring across the ocean because they have no prospects, no future, no ability to leave, no freedom of travel. And he said it broke his heart. And for him, the solution was that Israel should end the siege on Gaza in exchange for a long-term truce, which he described as a generational truce, not 1 year, not 2, not 5 years, so that the current generation of Palestinians and Israelis that were growing up would have a chance at some point in the future to come to a deal under better terms than what he and his generation had been forced to live under. So that's not the image that you tend to get of Yahya Sinwar, but this is what he spoke about to foreign media and in interviews that were then published in the Israeli newspapers. So in exchange for just ending the siege, he offered a long-term generational truce and the hope that Israeli children and Palestinian children could come to an agreement that would end this conflict once and for all. So
and one also just historical note that I think I always bring this up when we talk about the Great March of Return protests that you were just describing in 2018, that Sinwar and other Hamas officials endorsed, because it pushes back against the dominant narrative. But Palestinians go in the thousands and thousands to these protests, and Israeli snipers hold the competition who can kneecap or
Yep.
or permanently disable the
Yep.
largest number of unarmed Palestinian protesters during that period. So when people say, well, why didn't they protest nonviolently? Not only did they protest nonviolently, but Yahya Sinwar endorsed those protests, including to international media organizations.
Correct. And the world response to kind of this year-long peaceful protest was just complete. The world just shrugged. There was no pressure put on Israel to even ease the siege. Like I said, this wasn't a protest to create a kind of a final resolution to the conflict, just an end to this crippling siege that had de-developed Gaza and destroyed the lives of all its people. And I think for Hamas leaders, including Yahya Sinwar, that was instructive and transformational, because to them, they'd given, the way they saw it, is they'd given this route a chance. This was something that also, I mean, just to bring it back to someone like Mahmoud Abbas, this was the thing that he'd been endorsing. He said, if you want to resist, then we resist peacefully. We do unarmed resistance. We don't do armed resistance because of the power imbalance. So Hamas leaders in Gaza say, well, we tried that. And what we got was hundreds of people killed, tens of thousands of people wounded, and the world just would not engage with any of our proposals, even for a long-term truce. So in that, you see kind of the seeds for Operation Al-Aqsa Flood being planted there amongst Hamas's leaders.
Yeah, I want to also ask you about another figure whose name doesn't get often mentioned as often as Sinwar's, but of course he's very well known to the Israelis, and that is Mohammad Al-Deif. And Deif means the guest, and it's a nom de guerre. But Mohammad Al-Deif also is from Khan Yunis, and he became one of the earliest commanders of Al-Qassam, what became known as Al-Qassam brigades. But prior to Al-Qassam brigades, the armed wing affiliated with Hamas, there were clusters of Islamic resistance movements, but there wasn't one umbrella under which they operated. And Deif played a significant role in professionalizing and modernizing what would become then Al-Qassam brigades. And there's actually a very interesting documentary that Al Jazeera Arabic did I believe it came out in July of 2006, and it's called Hosted by the Rifle. And I recently rewatched the documentary, And Deif, who was a very mysterious figure to the Israelis because there are almost no photos of him. He very little was known about him for quite some time outside of small circles within Palestine, within Gaza itself. But in this documentary, the Al Jazeera correspondent actually interviews Mohammed Deif, and also Deif talks about the history of the formation of the Qassam brigades. And he and other figures within the Qassam brigades make an interesting point, which is that they have no interest in attacking outside of the historic boundaries of Palestine, that they're not interested in going to Europe to kill people, that they are engaged in a national liberation struggle. It's quite interesting to see and to hear the way that they describe their own operations. And it was right at the stage when Qassam was starting to increase its own domestic weapons manufacturing. So there's footage of them creating the early rockets that they were firing into Israel, how they had studied the American manufacture of grenades that they were equipping their forces with. Deif, of course, was killed in a heinous airstrike that the Israelis did that killed more than 90 people. It was a massive bombardment. It was unclear if he was alive or dead for months after that. This was in the summer of 2024. He was subsequently, along with Sinwar, indicted by the International Criminal Court at the end of 2024, but he had already been killed. But he himself is also a really fascinating figure and is widely believed to be the technical architect of Operation Al-Aqsa Flood. Mohammed, talk a bit about Mohammed Deif and his role in the historical context of Palestinian armed resistance.
So Mohammed Deif was, like you said, born again in the 60s in Khan Yunis refugee camp. And I spoke about how Yahya Sinwar was, during his time in prison, kind of an unknown figure to the Palestinian public. Well, Mohammed Deif was just completely unknown to everyone. He was a shadowy figure. The only time he'd ever appeared on video prior to that 2006 documentary you mentioned, Jeremy, was in 1993. He led a small group of Qassam fighters. This was when the Qassam brigades were literally just a small group of cells that shared the few light arms they had. And he led a group that kidnapped an Israeli soldier in 1993. And Deif was seen on video. He was wearing a light green sweater and his face covered in a keffiyeh. And he was the one who kind of gave the demands for the release of the soldier. He wanted the Hamas's spiritual leadership, Ahmed Yassin, to be freed from prison. And that was the last time Deif was seen. The Israelis actually found the safe house where their soldier was captured. They sent special forces in, and Deif actually managed to escape. And the next time kind of he was seen was in 1998. He wasn't seen in public, but the Palestinian Authority forces at the time picked him up and put him in jail during a mass crackdown on Hamas activists in the 90s. And then when the second Intifada broke out in late 2000, Mohammed Deif walked out of prison and was never seen in public again. Deif was, like you said, a transformational figure. He wasn't the first leader of the Qassam brigades, but when his predecessors were all assassinated, he took up the mantle and he helped transform Qassam brigades from, like I said, a small group of lightly armed cells to essentially an army with its own kind of specialized units, its production and manufacturing capabilities, thousands of trained and armed fighters, a general staff, a intelligence unit. Mohammed Deif was kind of overseeing all of that. But one thing that he did do was he institutionalized the Qassam brigades. And by doing that, and I think this is going to be his biggest legacy, he ensured that in the event of his own assassination or the killing of any other Qassam leaders, that the group would continue, or the militia would continue, and would not collapse.
I want to. We only have a few minutes left, but I want to ask you, in the context of the history of both Deif and Sinwar that you've laid out, and the issues circulating about Israel's demand that the Palestinians of Gaza be entirely disarmed. What do you see as, or when you think about it, and I know it's hard to think of the future, what we've seen over the past 18 months, in an epic sense, what do you think this is going to produce in the coming generations of Palestinians that are growing up, witnessing, enduring, surviving everything that they've survived? And I ask that because you hear this in every generation of Palestinians when they talk. So many of these people. It's why I say that in many ways Sinwar's story is the story of Gaza, because if you think about what was the life that they grew up under, you can draw an entire map of every Israeli war against Gaza, of the starvation campaigns, of the mowing the lawn, of the controlling of their calories, of the multiple wars, and now of the scorched earth genocide that has reduced cities down to dust. And feel free to answer this in a historical context, but what comes as a result of all of what we're witnessing now? Because this is a scale beyond anything we've seen over the past 76 years.
So when we talk about people like Yahya, Sinwar, and Mohammad Deif, and I want to point out that they are prominent kind of in the history of Palestinian resistance, but by no means were they the only figures there. Right. One of the things about Hamas, especially, is that it is a diffuse group where even the leaders act more as they act as figureheads more than executives. So there's a lot of consultation. There's a lot of devolvement of responsibilities, and so the group always can continue and reform and rebuild itself, even when its leaders are killed. But you talk about Mohammad Deif and Yahya Sinwar and others growing up, say, in the Khan Yunis refugee camp in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. They grew up under a military occupation where the only resistance to this military occupation was a stone, right? Stone throwing against the most heavily armed military in the Middle East. We're looking now at a generation that is growing up under genocide, that is seeing things that we can barely comprehend when we see them from thousands of miles away. We're talking about a generation where at least 20,000 children have become orphans. We're talking about a generation that is, according to the United Nations, I think something like 9 out of 10 children in Palestine, in Gaza, frequently think about dying, frequently think about death. You're talking about Gaza, where 50% of the population is under the age of 18. So what is the future for them? I don't know, how this is going to play out. But one thing I will say, kind of in the historical context of resistance, is whereas people like Mohammad Deif and Yahya Sinwar grew up with stones in their hands to confront the Israeli occupation, currently Palestinian children who are surviving this genocide are also seeing, people around them taking on Israeli tanks with rocket-propelled grenades, able to fire missiles at the Israelis, engage the Israelis in face-to-face combat. So this, I think, ties back to the Israeli demand for disarmament. It's not just an attempt to to end Hamas as a group or the Palestinian resistance as a presence. It's an attempt to kind of, I think, ensure against the future, because these children who have survived this genocide, it's going to be very, very difficult for them to accept the presence of Israel in whatever form comes in the future. And I think that is going to be the story of Palestinian resistance going forward.
Mohammad Alsaafin from AJ Plus, a great independent journalist. Thanks so much for taking the time to share your analysis with us.
Thank you, Jeremy.
And that does it for this live stream broadcast. We'll be here every Tuesday, if we can make it work, at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time in the United States. On behalf of all of my colleagues at DropSite, I want to thank all of our subscribers, both free and paid, for your support of DropSite News. If you're able to afford a paid subscription, it's what fuels our journalism. You can become a subscriber either free or paid at dropsitenews.com. Also, I know people have complicated thoughts about Twitter, X, but we have a great team of people that operate what really is like a 24-hour news service with a very sharp focus, not just on what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank, but also in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Syria, and beyond. Make sure to follow us on X. We're also on Blue Sky, on Instagram, and on other platforms. On behalf of everyone at the DropSite News team, I'm Jeremy Scahill. Thank you so much for being with us, and thank you for your support.